I'm going to tell you about the Voth, because if you don't understand what they were before all this happened, you won't understand what the story means. The Voth were not just a military force. They were a philosophy. They were the galaxy's oldest argument that power is the only language that matters, and they'd been making that argument for over 9,000 standard cycles, long before humanity figured out fire, long before the first human looked up at a night sky and thought, "What's out there?" By the time the two species made contact, and I want to be precise here, because contact is a generous word for what happened, the Voth had subjugated or eliminated 47 independent civilizations. 47. Some of those civilizations had been spacefaring for centuries longer than humans had been farming wheat. The Voth absorbed what was useful, eliminated what wasn't, and left the rest as cautionary monuments. They were enormous, not in a cartoonish, monster movie way, in a way that felt deliberately engineered because it probably was. The Voth had modified their own genetic code so many times over their history that whatever they'd originally been was buried somewhere deep inside what they'd become. They stood roughly 3 meters tall in their combat forms. Their exoskeletal plating, which was biological, grown from their own bodies, was rated to absorb impacts that would reduce most armored vehicles to slag. They had 6 limbs, 2 primary, 4 secondary. The secondary limbs were capable of independent neural control. You could cut the primary brain connection entirely, and those secondary limbs would keep fighting based on stored combat programming alone. They bled, technically, but their circulatory fluid was pressurized and carried self-sealing proteins that closed most combat wounds in under 4 seconds. And they were smart. This is the thing people forget, or maybe just don't want to acknowledge. The Voth weren't just physically overwhelming. They were brilliant strategic minds. Their admirals had studied warfare across 4 dozen civilizations. They had access to 47 different combat traditions, 800 years of compiled tactical analysis, and a cultural worldview that treated every problem as a dominance equation to be solved. When they found humanity, they solved their dominance equation the same way they always had. First, they watched, months of observation from the outer system recording everything: human military movements, communications, infrastructure, population distribution, psychological response patterns to emergencies. They cataloged how humans reacted to fear because that was always the first phase. Understand the fear response, then weaponize it. What they saw worried them slightly, but not enough. Humans, to Voth strategic analysts, were illogically aggressive. The Voth were used to civilizations that prioritized survival above all things. Most species, when confronted with a force they couldn't match, ran calculations and surrendered. It was rational. The Voth had evolved in a universe where surrender meant life, and resistance meant extinction. Humans didn't seem to have that programming. The Voth noted it as a variable. They planned around it. They had encountered aggressive species before. They had never encountered one that stayed aggressive after the first demonstration. Their first demonstration, they calculated, would be sufficient. They were wrong. I need to tell you what their first demonstration looked like, because it's the kind of thing that defies ordinary description. And yet it's important, crucial, actually, that you understand the scale of what humanity was staring at before any of what came next made any sense. 47 vessels. That was the initial Voth approach formation, not their full fleet, their greeting party. They called it a demonstration of scale in their tactical doctrine. Show the new civilization your greeting party and let them understand that this isn't even the main force. The ships were enormous. The smallest was roughly 2 kilometers bow to stern. The largest, the flagship, the Ascendancy Prime, stretched 17 kilometers of black alloy and bioceramic hull plating, designed to absorb radar and light in certain spectrums, so that the first thing you saw of it was a shape in space that shouldn't be there. A darkness that was too dense to be vacuum. They entered the Tesseract belt, a stretch of space between the outer human colony worlds and the galactic rim, in perfect formation, close enough to human sensor nets that detection was guaranteed, far enough out that they had response time to observe the reaction. The reaction was supposed to be panic, communication spikes, civilian evacuation signals, military vessels scrambling into defensive positions that the Voth computers would analyze and find predictably inadequate. What they got instead confused their analysts for about 16 minutes. Because the human response was quiet. Not the quiet of shock, not the quiet of frozen fear. The quiet of people who had already done their thinking and were now past the part where they had feelings about it. That's the part of the story I was there for. I should tell you who I am before I go any further, because this account is going to shift around between witnesses, and you should know where this particular set of eyes was standing. My name is Coordinator Usalindra Mao. I was, at the time of the Tesseract engagement, the senior diplomatic coordinator for the Outer Rim Human Colonial Authority, which sounds impressive and organized, and I want to assure you it was neither of those things in practice. My office was 3 converted cargo containers bolted to the side of a fuel processing platform in orbit around Tesseract 6, the largest of the human colony worlds in the belt. I was there because someone had decided, several decision layers above my pay grade, that a senior diplomatic presence in the Outer Rim was important, and then discovered there was no budget to build an actual diplomatic station, so they'd sent me instead, with a staff of 4, and a communication array that was reliable about 60% of the time. I want to be clear about this because I think it's important. I was not a military person. I had no military training. I had spent my career learning to talk to people across cultural and language gaps. I was deeply and completely unqualified for what was about to happen to me. When the Voth ships appeared on our sensors, I was eating lunch, rehydrated noodles, the kind that come in a packet with a picture of a bowl of fresh noodles on the outside, which I think is the universe's most optimistic form of false advertising. My communications officer, a young man named Prashant Devraj, 23 years old, originally from a colony on Tesseract 3, who had a habit of talking very fast when he was nervous, came through my office door without knocking. He said, "Coordinator, we have a situation." I said, "Define situation." He said, 47 large unknown vessels just transited into the belt. They are not responding to standard hailing frequencies. They are broadcasting on a frequency our computers flagged as a known aggressive contact pre-signal. I put my noodles down. "A known what?" "Aggressive contact pre-signal," he said again faster. "It's in the database. The Galactic Council circulated threat assessment files about 2 years ago. Remember, the Voth Dominion. The files nobody really read because everyone assumed they were the kind of threat assessment document that gets written to justify budget allocations and nothing ever actually." Prashant: "Yes. Are those the Voth?" He swallowed hard. "The signal matches, Coordinator." I stared at him for a moment, then I looked at my noodles. Then I stood up, and I went to my communications console, and I did something that in hindsight I'm still not entirely sure was the right decision, but it was the only decision I could think of in that moment. I opened a channel to the Tesseract Colonial Defense Force. The voice that answered wasn't a voice I recognized. It was calm, very, very calm, the kind of calm that sounds like something you're doing rather than something you feel. "Colonial Defense, Commander Eris Valkani." "Commander," I said, "this is Coordinator Mao at the diplomatic platform. I assume you're seeing what we're seeing." "Yes. And we're working on it," she said. Just like that, we're working on it. 47 ships, 17-kilometer flagship. Species that had eliminated 47 civilizations. We're working on it. I said, Commander, with respect, what does working on it mean in this context? There was a brief pause, not long, maybe 2 seconds. Then Commander Valcani said, it means the Voth think this is a conversation about whether we fight. We're trying to make sure they understand it's a conversation about how. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think anyone in the belt did. Part 2, the 47 hours. This next section draws on multiple sources, because the 47 hours following Voth arrival in the Tessavar belt were witnessed differently by different people, and I think all of those perspectives matter. The Voth called their initial contact phase the weighing. It was standard procedure. You arrive. You establish presence. You allow the target civilization 48 hours to process the reality of their situation and produce an appropriate response. The appropriate response, historically, from every civilization that had survived long enough to provide data, was a communication requesting terms of submission. What they were unprepared for was receiving, within 6 hours of their arrival, a response that was not a request for terms. It was a question. Recovered Voth Admiral Communication Log, Admiral Scareth Vaughn, Commanding Ascendancy Prime. Translated from Voth Dominion Cipher, Standard Galactic Council Translation Protocol. Reference, HPC 7741 Dreadcom 01. VONN, Communications. What is the content of the human transmission? Com Officer, Admiral. The transmission is a question. VONN, elaborate. Com Officer, the human communication states, and I am translating precisely. We see you. We know what you are. We have one question before we decide how to proceed. How many of those 47 ships do you need to feel safe? 17-second pause in recording. VONN, send it again. I want verification on the translation. Com Officer, verified Admiral. Translation confirmed across 3 independent translation matrices. The question is, how many of those 47 ships do you need to feel safe? 11-second pause. VONN, they think we are afraid. Com Officer, Admiral, shall I draft a response? VONN, do not respond yet. I want behavioral analysis on this transmission. Specifically, determine whether this is a cultural face-saving mechanism, an attempt to create false parity, or whether the humans are genuinely under the misapprehension that we require emotional support. Com Officer, yes, Admiral. VONN, and get me every piece of intelligence we have on human military capacity in this region. Com Officer, Admiral, our intelligence indicates that the human colonial defense force in this region consists of approximately 43 vessels, the largest of which is 800 meters in classification. They have ground installations on 2 of the belt worlds. Population approximately 12 million. VONN, 43 vessels. Com Officer, yes, Admiral. VONN, against 47. Com Officer, yes, Admiral. VONN, and they asked us how many ships we need to feel safe. Com Officer, yes, Admiral. 22-second pause. VONN, run the behavioral analysis. I want answers in one cycle. I got the transcript of that exchange later. Much later, after the whole thing was over and the archivists were assembling the record. Reading it in hindsight, I keep coming back to that 22-second pause. I've thought about it a lot. The Voth, by every account we have, were not prone to long pauses. Their command culture was built on decisiveness. Their admirals were conditioned from early development to process, decide, and act. Long pauses were seen as a weakness, a sign of analytical failure. Admiral Scareth Vaughn paused for 22 seconds. I think, and this is my interpretation, I want to be clear about that, I think it was the first moment in his career that he encountered something that didn't fit into any of his existing categories. The question implied a frame of reference he didn't have vocabulary for. Not whether you're threatening us, whether you're afraid. The Voth inspired fear. They were not built to understand being asked about their own. The person who sent that message was Commander Eris Valkani. I want to tell you about her, because she is central to everything that follows, and because I think she tends to get described in terms that make her sound like a superhero or a symbol or an archetype, and that bothers me. She was a person. A specific, complicated, occasionally frustrating person, and she deserves to be understood as such. Eris Valkani was 41 years old when the Voth arrived. She had grown up on Tessevar II, the smaller of the two inhabited worlds in the belt, in a settlement that at the time of her birth had a population of about 900 people. The settlement was a mining operation, asteroid processing, primarily, and her childhood was defined by the particular combination of resource scarcity and community density that characterizes small frontier habitats. Everyone knew everyone. Everything was shared, or nothing was sustainable. She had joined the Colonial Defense Force at 18, served in 3 low-intensity conflicts with claim jumpers, and 1 genuinely nasty engagement with a pirate operation that had set up in the Outer Rim. She had worked her way up to commander through what her service record describes as exceptional situational analysis and uncommon steadiness under pressure. That's the official language. The people I talked to who served with her before the Voth engagement used different language. One of her former tactical officers, a woman named Sergeant Bikel Ibarra, described her this way. She was the calmest person I'd ever met in a crisis. Not fake calm, not performing calm, actually calm, like some part of her brain that other people use for panic had just been repurposed. I used to think it was a gift. Later, I thought it was training. Now I think it was something she decided to be and worked at until it was true. Another officer, Lieutenant Cade Osmond, told me, she never pretended things weren't bad. That's what I think people misunderstand about her. She never minimized anything. She'd look at the situation and say, yes, this is exactly as bad as you think it is, maybe worse. And then she'd say, so here's what we're doing. Like the second sentence always followed the first. That's what made you trust her. She wouldn't lie to you about the problem, but she also wouldn't stop at the problem. That's the person who sent the Voth, a question asking how many ships they needed to feel safe. I finally got Commander Valkani on a direct channel about 14 hours after the Voth appeared. I want to include this conversation because it tells you something about where her head was that I think matters. I said, Commander, Coordinator Mao, I wanted to check in on the situation. She said, Coordinator, good timing. I was going to reach out anyway. I need to ask you something. I said, of course. She said, how much does the Galactic Council know about what's happening in the belt right now? I said, I've been transmitting status updates every 4 hours. There's a communication lag of about 11 hours to the Council relay, so they know what was happening 11 hours ago. She said, so they know the Voth showed up. Yes. Do they know what our response has been? I said carefully, they know you sent a communication to the Voth fleet. There was a brief pause, then she said, did they like it? I said, I have received 4 separate urgent messages from 4 different council members, asking me to clarify whether the Colonial Defense Force has experienced a command breakdown. She actually laughed. It was a short laugh. Not a happy laugh exactly, but a real one. Good, she said. If the Council's nervous, the Voth are definitely nervous. They'll be watching Council communications. They always do. Commander, I said, can I ask what is the actual plan here? And she said something I have thought about almost every day since. She said, the plan is to change what they think they know about us. Everything they've built, their whole strategy, their whole approach, it's based on data from 47 civilizations who all responded to them the same way. See a threat bigger than you, calculate that resistance is futile request terms. That's the pattern. That's what they're built around. So you're breaking the pattern. I'm trying to make them understand the pattern is wrong, she said. Not just for us, for everything that came before us too. They think those 47 civilizations surrendered because they were weak. I think they surrendered because they hadn't decided what they were willing to pay. I said, and we have. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, we've been on this frontier for 3 generations. Everyone out here came because somewhere else got too crowded, too controlled, or too dangerous, and they decided to go somewhere hard and build something real. These aren't people who are going to look at 47 Voth ships and recalculate what's acceptable. But Commander, I said, because I felt I had to say it, I felt I was the only person in a position to say it, we can't match them. Not militarily. They have 47 ships. We have 43 and ours are. I know what ours are, she said quietly, not interrupting me exactly, more like finishing my sentence for me gently. Coordinator, the last thing I want to do is fight them ship to ship. That's not the plan. The plan is to make them decide that whatever they'd gain from this isn't worth what it would cost them. I said, do you think that's possible? She said, I think they have never met a species that wasn't afraid of them. And I think that lack of experience is the biggest vulnerability they have. Part 3, the demonstration. The Voth issued their formal ultimatum at the 26-hour mark. I say formal ultimatum because they had, according to their tactical doctrine, already issued the informal one. Showing up with 47 warships was the informal ultimatum. The formal one was text, precise. Delivered in 3 languages simultaneously, Voth Dominion Prime, Galactic Standard, and notably English, which told you something about how well they'd been watching before they arrived. The ultimatum stated, essentially, submit to Dominion authority, accept a Voth administrative presence on all belt colonies, provide a census of all human population centers for integration assessment, and acknowledge Voth territorial claim over the Tessevar belt within 22 hours. Failure to comply would result in a demonstration of Dominion capacity, which was the polite way of saying they would destroy something. Every previous civilization had received some version of this ultimatum. Every previous civilization, all 47 of them, had either complied or received the demonstration and then complied. The demonstration was never the whole population. It was never even the majority. It was always enough. 1 city, 1 installation, 1 fleet, something that made the calculation undeniable. Commander Valcani did not respond to the ultimatum. Not right away, not with text anyway. What she did at the 28-hour mark, 2 hours after the Voth deadline for a response, was this. She sent a fleet formation. Not to attack, not maneuvering aggressively. She sent every colonial defense vessel in the Tessevar belt into a specific formation, a wide arc spanning the approach vector between the Voth fleet and the 2 inhabited colony worlds, 43 ships. The biggest were 800 meters. Some were barely 300. A few were civilian vessels that had been armed in the past 18 hours with weapons systems that the colonial defense engineers had pulled from storage and bolted onto hardpoints that were, in some cases, freshly welded. They weren't there to stop the Voth fleet. She knew they couldn't stop the Voth fleet. They were there to say something. The Voth behavioral analysts, according to communications we recovered later, spent 6 hours trying to decode the message. They ran the formation through 67 tactical templates and found no strategic logic to it. The human ships were spread too wide to function as a coherent defensive screen. They were too thin to absorb a concentrated assault. They weren't maneuvering, weren't probing, weren't doing anything that fit any known pattern. And then one of the Voth analysts, a young officer, according to the records, just out of whatever Voth equivalent of an academy they had, offered an interpretation that silenced the room. The analyst said, they know they can't win, they're there anyway. Recovered Voth Fleet Analysis Report, Behavioral Assessment Division. Analyst, Subcommander Erithka. Reference, HPC 7741, Dread Analysis 07. Conclusion: the human formation is not a tactical deployment, it is a statement of intent. By positioning their vessels at maximum coverage of civilian population centers, without concentrating for any offensive capability, the human commander has indicated the following. First, she does not intend to survive this engagement. No commander positions forces this way if they expect to win. This is a formation designed to absorb damage and maximize the cost to the aggressor, not to achieve victory. Second, she expects her vessels to be destroyed. She has positioned them so that the destruction of each ship creates maximum coverage time for civilian evacuation. She is not defending territory. She is buying time. Third, she sent this formation without responding to our ultimatum. This means the formation is her response to the ultimatum. She is communicating, we know the cost. We have assessed it, we are willing to pay. Analysis recommendation: we are operating outside normal behavioral parameters. I recommend issuing a second communication requesting dialogue before proceeding to demonstration phase. Historical data suggests demonstration phase produces compliance. This species has not produced any historical data consistent with that prediction. This recommendation was overruled by Admiral Vaughn. End report. The demonstration happened at hour 31. I want to be very precise about what happened and what didn't, because this moment has been reported inaccurately in so many subsequent accounts that the actual event sometimes gets lost. The Voth did not attack a colony world. They did not attack a civilian population center. What they did was destroy an unmanned industrial platform, a fuel processing station in the outer belt, using a single capital weapon. It was a precisely chosen target, large enough to be visible to sensors across the belt. Unmanned, which the Voth knew from their surveillance, so the loss of life would be zero. This was standard demonstration doctrine. You show capability. You make it undeniable. You don't maximize casualties in the demonstration because mass casualties at that phase produce a particular human-adjacent psychological response that the Voth had learned, across 47 civilizations, was counterproductive. Grief plus rage was harder to negotiate with than raw fear. The demonstration was designed to produce fear, not grief. They destroyed the platform in approximately 4 seconds. The weapon, a focused, coherent energy projector that the Colonial Defense Records classified as capital grade Tier 8, hit the platform and the platform was gone. Not damaged, not burning. Gone. Where there had been a structure, there was briefly a light and then nothing. I saw it from my window on the diplomatic platform. I want to tell you exactly what it looked like, because I was there and I should try to describe it accurately. It looked like someone had deleted a piece of the universe, like a cut in reality. The platform was there, and then there was a flash of something that wasn't quite light, more like intensity, and then the platform wasn't there. No debris. The Voth weapon had been precise enough that the energy dispersion consumed the platform entirely. I stood at my window for a long time after that. Prashant came to stand beside me. He didn't say anything. He was 23 years old from Tessevar 3, and he had family on Tessevar 3, and I think we were both very carefully not thinking about what that weapon would do to something that wasn't a fuel platform. After a while I said, we should probably document this. He said, I've been recording since it happened. Of course he had. He was better at his job than I gave him credit for. Commander Valcani's response came 47 minutes after the demonstration. Not to the Voth. To the Colonial Defense Fleet. She opened a general address channel, one that she knew because she had been informed was being monitored by Voth intelligence, and she said this. I'm reading from the transcript because I want to make sure I get every word right. She said, This is Commander Valkani to all colonial defense vessels and personnel. The Voth have demonstrated their capability. We saw it. I don't want anyone to misunderstand what that weapon can do, or to tell themselves it was smaller than it looked, or to manage their feelings by convincing themselves the threat is overstated. It is not overstated. They are everything they appear to be. And I am going to tell you exactly one thing about that. It doesn't change anything. We are not going to submit. We are not going to give them a census of our people. We are not going to acknowledge their territorial claim. We are not going to do any of what they have asked, because the moment we do, we are not protecting our people. We are handing our people to a process we cannot control, run by a species that has made its values very clear. There are 47 ships in front of us. I know what 43 of ours are up against. I know the math. I am asking you to do something harder than math. I am asking you to hold your positions and trust that there is more than one way to fight. The Voth have spent 9,000 cycles learning how civilizations die. I am betting everything I have that they have not spent enough time learning how humans live. Valkani out. I was at my console when that transmission went out. I heard it in real time, and I want to tell you what I felt, because I think my reaction was probably representative of a lot of people in the belt that night. I was terrified. I was genuinely, deeply, physically terrified. My hands were shaking. Prashant's hands were shaking. There was nobody in my office who wasn't shaking. But underneath the fear, underneath it, underneath the shaking and the cold and the image of that platform disappearing, underneath all of that, something had shifted. A very small thing, like a gear clicking into a different position. Not confidence exactly. Something more elemental than confidence. Resolve maybe, or just clarity. The kind you feel when you realize a decision has been made, and the making of it took something off your shoulders that had been weighing on you longer than you knew. Part 4, the night between. The next 12 hours are the hardest to describe. Nothing happened. That's the thing. After the demonstration, after Valkani's address, the Voth did not move. The colonial defense fleet held its arc. The two colony worlds processed through their evacuation protocols, moving civilians from the most exposed settlements into underground facilities that had been built years earlier for exactly this type of scenario, and that most people had assumed they'd never need. I spent those 12 hours doing my job, which mostly consisted of answering communications from a galactic council that was increasingly alarmed by what was happening in the Tessevar belt and increasingly unsure what to do about it. Several council members wanted to send a diplomatic mission. Several others wanted to send military support, which would have taken weeks to arrive and therefore wasn't actually an option. One council member, and I'm not going to name them because I don't think it's fair, transmitted a message suggesting that a realistic assessment of the situation might lead the belt colonies to consider the long-term benefits of accommodation. I responded to that message very carefully and very professionally. I also very carefully and very professionally deleted the first 3 drafts of my response, because they were neither careful nor professional. What I was really doing in those 12 hours was watching. Our sensor arrays were tracking the Voth fleet continuously. They weren't moving, but they were transmitting Voth internal communications, heavily encrypted, which our systems couldn't break in real time. We were logging everything for later analysis. What we could see was their formation, and sometime around hour 10 of those 12 quiet hours, Prashant came to me with something he'd noticed. He said, "Coordinator, look at this." He showed me a sensor overlay, the positions of all 47 Voth ships, overlaid with their positions from the previous 12 hours. I said, "What am I looking at?" He said, "They've moved, slightly, all of them. The formation has contracted, they're tighter together than they were." I stared at the overlay. I said, "That could be a tactical repositioning." He said, I ran it through the tactical analysis the colonial defense gave us access to. It doesn't match any offensive repositioning pattern. It's more consistent with a defensive clustering response. I stared at it for a long time. 47 Voth warships, greatest military force in the known galaxy, species that had defeated every civilization they'd ever encountered, and they were, according to our analysis, clustering closer together. Like something had made them nervous. I called Commander Valkani. I said, "Commander, I have an observation I want to share." She said, "The formation contraction. Yes, I see it." "You saw it already." "I've been watching their formation for the past 6 hours," she said. "They've contracted 4 times, small movements, but consistent." I said, "What does it mean?" And she said something I wasn't expecting. She said, "It means our ships are bothering them." I said, "Our ships?" "Yes. Our ships that are badly outgunned and positioned in a formation that your own tactical officers told me makes no strategic sense." "That's exactly it," she said, and I could hear something in her voice that I want to try to describe accurately. It wasn't quite excitement. It was more like recognition, like someone watching something they'd theorized for a long time actually happen in real life. The formation makes no strategic sense. They've run it through their tactical matrices, and they can't categorize it. They don't know what to do with a commander who isn't playing for odds. I said slowly, "They don't know how to fight someone who isn't trying to win. They don't know how to fight someone who's decided that winning isn't the measure," she said. "Every civilization they've beaten has been trying to win or trying to survive. We're just here. We're here because we've decided to be here. And that is apparently a concept that their entire strategic database is not equipped to process." She paused. Then, "The clusters are getting tighter because some part of their command structure is experiencing something it hasn't experienced before. And when organisms experience something new that their instincts can't categorize, they pull together. It's the most ancient response there is. When you don't know what the threat is, you get close to what you know." I said, "But we're not threatening them." "No," she said. "We're something worse. We're confusing them. And for a species that has spent 9,000 cycles being certain about everything, that's worse than a threat." Part 5. What came over the hill? Hour 42. This is where everything changed. And I want to be very careful in how I describe this, because what happened at hour 42 has been described in some accounts as a battle, and it wasn't. It was something harder to categorize. Commander Valkani made a move. Not with the fleet held its arc. What she moved was a single ship, the smallest vessel in the colonial defense formation, a patrol craft called the Meridian, crew of 11, armed with weapons systems that were, against Voth capital-class armor, roughly equivalent to throwing rocks. She sent the Meridian forward. Not fast, not aggressive, slow, deliberate. The Meridian moved out of the defensive arc and traveled toward the Voth fleet, decelerating to a speed that was, to put it plainly, almost walking pace by spaceship standards. Its communications array was broadcasting on every frequency, Voth Standard, Galactic Standard, 8 other recognized contact protocols, and the message it was broadcasting was simple. "We want to talk. Not we request negotiation, not we seek terms, just we want to talk." I found out later that Commander Valkani had been very specific with Captain Yusuf Ibarra, Sergeant Bikel Ibarra's older brother, as it happens. And yes, I know the coincidence is uncomfortable, and I don't think Valkani planned it that way. But I think the reason she chose Yusuf was because she needed someone on that ship who she was absolutely certain wouldn't flinch, and she knew the Ibarra family. I found out later that she had been very specific with Captain Yusuf Ibarra about what "we want to talk" meant and what it didn't mean. It didn't mean they were surrendering. It didn't mean they were requesting terms. It meant they were telling the Voth, "Come talk to us if you want to talk." Or don't, and we'll all stand here until you decide. The meridian stopped 800 kilometers from the edge of the Voth Formation. 800 kilometers is nothing in space. It is roughly nothing, a round trip in a fast shuttle. The meridian could be destroyed from that distance in approximately the time it takes to breathe in and out. Captain Ibarra brought the ship to rest, cut the main drives, and waited. Personal log, Captain Yusuf Ibarra, CDS Meridian. Recovered from Meridian Black Box recording. Reference, HPC 7741 Dread Log 04. Recording timestamp, hour 42 minute 18. We're stopped, 800 clicks from the lead elements of the Voth Formation. I can see their ships on the forward display. I want to be honest about this recording. The commander told me to keep a log because this is history and someone should record what it actually feels like, not just what the sensor arrays capture. What it actually feels like. It feels like standing in front of a wall, a very large wall. I have been in engagements before. I have been in situations where I thought I might die. This is different from those situations. This is standing in front of something that could destroy this ship and everyone on it in a time period that would be too short to measure on a human scale. My crew they're good. Nadia has the navigation console, and she hasn't looked up from it in 20 minutes, which I recognize as her processing mechanism. Quaim is running continuous sensor sweeps, which is also his processing mechanism. The others are doing their jobs with the kind of focused intensity that you see in people who have decided that doing their jobs very well is the best available response to an impossible situation. I told them before we left the Ark, if the Voth respond aggressively, we hold position. We don't run. We hold position and we keep broadcasting. Quaim asked me why. I said because if we run, they learn that we run. And if we hold, they learn something different. He asked what they'd learn. I said I thought they'd learn something they hadn't expected to learn from us. He said what? I said patience. Pause in recording. The Voth Formation is moving, not all of it, one ship. Medium classification by Voth standards, it's coming toward us. Hold on. 43-second gap in recording. There is a Voth vessel approximately 60 kilometers from our position. It has matched our heading and velocity. It has cut its main drives. It has activated a communications array. I am going to open a channel. Recording continues. What happened over the next 3 hours between the Meridian and the Voth vessel, later identified as a diplomatic cruiser called the Exactitude of Purpose, is documented in the full contact record, which runs to several hundred pages and is available in the archive for anyone with appropriate clearance. I'm not going to reproduce all of it here. What I'm going to tell you is what mattered. The Voth opened with the standard Dominion contact protocol. Identification, rank, territory claim demands. Captain Ibarra responded with his name, his rank, his ship's designation, and the population of the Tessevar Belt. The Voth said, "You understand the terms." Ibarra said, "I understand you believe those are terms. I'm not authorized to discuss terms. I was sent to ask a question." The Voth said, "What question?" Ibarra said, "We want to know how many of the 47 civilizations you've conquered asked you this conversation." There was a pause, then the Voth said, "None." Ibarra said, "Right, and I want you to think about why that is, because I don't think the answer is that all 47 were weaker than us. I think the answer is that all 47 calculated whether they could win and found the answer was no. And we made a different calculation. So I want to know, has anyone ever made a different calculation before? Because if the answer is no, if we're actually the first, then you don't actually know what happens next, do you?" The Voth went quiet for 11 minutes. 11 minutes in the log. 11 minutes of an open channel with no transmission. Then they said, "What do you want?" And Ibarra said, "I already told you, we want to talk."